Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Do you want to skip to the second?
So we're gonna get started. So welcome everyone to the launch of Sexuality Beyond Consent. Apparently, quite a few people are ready to move beyond consent. We'll see what that looks like. Welcome to the Bureau of General Services Queer Division. My name is Greg Newton. I am the co-founder, along with my partner, Don Jokum, of the Bureau. And the Bureau is the space you are in right now. The short explanation for our long name is that we are a government agency for a government that does not yet exist. And the service that we provide is holding this space for queer books and queer culture of all kinds. So thanks very much for coming out tonight. I think we're getting a little feedback. So let me turn this down. So the Bureau is a queer bookstore. We have regular bookstore hours, Wednesdays through Sundays from 1 to 7 p.m. And then we stay open late when we have events such as this. We are an all-volunteer organization, and tonight I'm being helped out by Bella Florence and Hal Lance. Thank you very much. And the Bureau survives by selling books and taking donations. So we do have a suggested donation of $10. I'm going to pass this around. You can also Venmo us at BGSQD. Those letters are all around. And if money is tight and you want to buy a book, you should hold on to your money to buy a book. But if you're not buying a book, we'd love it if you throw something in here. There's some change. Thank you. And if you're not already on our email list, you can sign up for that at the back of the room, and you'll get an email every other Monday about our many upcoming events. And we usually have art on the walls. We're in between shows right now. We have an opening on Friday for a show with Charlie Welch called It Will End in Tears, which hopefully tonight will not end in tears. And before I introduce our panelists, I am going to read a brief land acknowledgement, and then we'll get started. So the Bureau acknowledges that our organization operates on the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape. We are actively seeking to partner with and provide material support to a local queer Indigenous organization. We hope to make an announcement about this partnership in the near future, but in the meantime, we encourage you to join the Bureau in signing up to make a monthly donation to the American Indian Community House's Mannahatta Fund. The Mannahatta Fund, according to its website, is an invitation to all settlers and non-native people who wish to acknowledge the legacy of theft and genocide that comprise the history of New York City and the United States. And you can find out more about that at mannahattafund.org. So, Dr. Avgi Saketopoulou, did I do that relatively okay? Is an award-winning psychoanalyst living and working in New York City. She is a member of the faculty of NYU's postdoctoral program in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. Her interview on relational psychoanalysis is part of the permanent collection of the Freud Museum in Vienna. And in 2021, she co-chaired the first US-based conference dedicated to the work of Jean Laplanche. Joshua Takano Chambers Letson is Associate Professor of Performance Studies at Northwestern University, author of After the Party, a Manifesto for Queer of Color Life, and co-editor of the Sexual Culture series, NYU Press. And now I'm going to turn it over to Anne Pellegrini to say a few words before we jump in. Thank you.
Thanks for having a little bit of a party going on. So I just wanted to say a few words. I'll shortly be hearing from Josh Chambers-Letson in conversation with Avgi Saketopoulou. And Josh and Tavia Nyango and I are the co-editors of the Sexual Culture series at New York University Press. And the entire Sexual Cultures team and our editor, Eric Zinner, whom we've been working with. I've been working with Eric in the series for 25 years. We started the series with Jose Munoz in 1998. Our first book came out in 1999. It's amazing, a silver anniversary launch with this book. Bob and Josh since 2014, and it's a series that attempts to queer what queer is, what queer can be, what queer can do, what queer can think. And this book tonight is doing some of that amazing work. And you will shortly be acquainted with that book and with that author, and it will be an experience, right? I want to tell you a few things about the format for this evening. Basically, both Josh and Avgi will speak for about 10 minutes. We'll hear from Avgi first. After that more structured part of the conversation, they're going to dive into it and get into a conversation about the book. And then they're going to open it up to the room for conversation. And I also want to invite you, we're going to end at 8:20, about 8:20, and I want to invite you to stick around for a surprise. And I can't tell you what surprise is, because part of the premise of Avgi's book is we have to risk and experience whose outcome we do not know. So we're going to take you to the Austin practice. Welcome, Dr.
Hi. We're just going to talk to each other with the mics turned away. It's going to be a painful experience for all of you.
So let me start. I feel like I won the Oscar, so I want to say some things about how I came to this. I want to start by thanking the Sexual Culture series and Josh, who was my corresponding editor, and as I like to say, my seducer, because it was Josh that first invited me and convinced me and stood by my side and pushed me in all the good ways and challenged me to be able to write this book. So I'm very grateful to you, Josh. Thank you, Eric, for taking a chance on psychoanalysis. I hope that we can begin to see what psychoanalysis can do for queerness, and it is not the low bar of inclusivity that psychoanalysis is kind of like extravagantly offering right now, which I think is kind of like actually pretty kind of like uninteresting. And thank you all for being here today. I have so many things to say, but I think that what I will do is read a little bit, and then maybe we will have, the plan is that we'll have a short conversation and then invite you in.
While she's reading, I'm going to go to the side so you don't have to watch me watch you.
I also want to say the book, I want to start with something else. The book is dedicated to my grandmother. And today would have been her birthday. So it feels especially moving and kind of like an interesting accident that the launch is today. So thank you so much for being here. I'm going to read from a few parts of the book. Here goes. I was drawn to writing this book as my way of coping with the strain of watching slave play. A play that, as you will read in chapter 4, overwhelmed me and startled me. I wrote this book because I could not look away, because I wanted, or more precisely, because I needed to forge a relationship with the aesthetic experience that slave play roused in me. The risk of reading this book, no less than the risk of writing it, is to experience what happens when we expose ourselves to something unknown, not knowing where it will take us, including to unfamiliar concepts and texts, or to defamiliarize uses of concepts and texts that we thought we knew. I also wrote this book for you, not the plural you, but the singular you. You can read it for its ideas, and I hope you will. But this is not only a book about ideas, it's a book that also wants to give you an experience. Writing this way is a risk. It has required a great vulnerability of me. Writing this book has also led me to places that I did not expect to go, to experiences that I did not expect to have. It has taken me to places that scare me. More than once, I found myself before something much bigger than myself towering over me. And I have written this book so that you can follow me there. You do not know what you will experience, what you will encounter, how it may disturb you, what it may set in motion for you. But if you stay with me, and if you go slow, if you linger in the interstitial spaces between reach and grasp, this book can give you more. It can demand something of you. Perhaps you will have an experience yourself. More than anything, I wrote this book for readers who savor their experiences and who are willing to push themselves to the limits of self-understanding, who are able and eager even to bend their will. For readers willing to be pulled out of reason, to tread into something raw and tender. For readers who yearn to go beyond the sensible, there is an elsewhere in yourself in which these pages may take you. And I have, in fact, written this book, imagining you giving yourself over to me, which is a strange thing to say, given that I don't know you, and neither do you. So let us begin. Pull my hair up. Give me a second. I'm going to read two more passages. Two years ago, I was ravished by Jeremy O'Hara's theatrical work, Slave Play. Describing my experience this way may sound melodramatic, but my language is intentional, meant to do more than amplify how much I liked the play or felt changed by it, though both are also true. What took me over was far wilder and infinitely more bizarre. It felt absolutely necessary. The first time I saw this play, I felt my whole being called to attention, rousing my senses in a way that no work of art ever has before. From there on out, I was overcome with a fiery desire to experience the play again and again. All I knew was that I wanted more. Interests that normally held my attention were overshadowed. Everything else felt simply dampened. What followed was a long period of what I can describe only as a possession, as if I had been taken over by a strange force. Repeatedly attending performances felt more like a path I had to follow than a decision, and only in retrospect did I connect this feeling of being possessed to Freud's description of repetition as a demonic force, or link it to the play's third act, which is titled Exorcism. What exactly is the it to be exorcised? And in fact, whether that it can be exercised at all, which throughout this book I argue is a traumatophobic response, or whether that it may be merely brought into presence so that one can make contact with it, which in the book I describe as traumatophilia, is the main theme explored in this chapter. Strangely, and throughout the book, this experience also felt liberating, though if you ask me what I felt liberated from, I could not tell you. I became preoccupied with reading and rereading the script, with thinking and rethinking the dialogue. Week after week, I attended Sunday discussions organized by the play's production. I went enthusiastically and enjoyed them immensely, but I was also chagrined to realize that I could not go. So even as professional obligations and deadlines, and I dragged everybody with me. I dragged everybody who would come. Some of you are laughing, you've been there with me. Even as professional obligations and deadlines pressed for my time, I nonetheless found myself regularly heading out for the Sunday salons, eager yet also hopeless to resist them. I was fascinated, but also scared by this play and by my own reactions to it. In retrospect, I was drawn to it like one who, standing over a cliff, looks down and feels an inexplicable draw, stepping back. But I didn't step back. I stepped into the vertigo. For a year and a half, I watched the play again and again. I watched it alone, I watched it with others. I went in planned times, and I also went impulsively, as if seized by a grotesque longing. I once headed to the matinee right after the Sunday salon, because the discussion stirred in me a need to experience the play right away. Over time, and one repetition after another, I started observing small differences in the way the actors enunciated their lines, the way their bodies' affective charge shifted across performances. I talked about the play incessantly to anybody who's willing to listen. I have some students and colleagues from study groups with me today here, and I know that they know that they've been hearing about this for a while. Friends forwarded me announcements about talks, interviews, and podcasts, and they did my preoccupation. Becoming so infatuated with work of art is not an experience I had had before. It was dazzlingly intense, and it was also dizzyingly burdensome. I found the demands of my interests confusing, exhausting, even terrifying, and that only drew me in. In retrospect, I would say that I followed the play the way one follows around a lover before one's first heartbreak, before, that is, one learns to hold some things back. This is from the conclusion of the book. Other than slave play, the book also talks about the night porter, which some of you may be familiar with. The night porter and slave play are examples of art that takes itself into the disaster, rather than merely protesting hopelessly against it, is a quote from Adorno. Who, Adorno asks, quote, wants to stick around for that, to experience the disaster, unquote. Contrary to social life, where subjects do not get to choose if and which disaster befalls them, some art invites us into the wreckage. Not everyone has the bandwidth to look or to look again, and not everyone will be able to look in order to eavesdrop on themselves, to tune in to get what gets roused inside them. Those who do meet the aesthetic object at the limits of their consent, rather than ask why somebody would step willingly into the fray of their traumatic. To ask, that is, after their psychology, their motives, or their intent, which is what psychoanalysis usually does. My project tries to raise a different set of queries that have to do with how such art and performance acts on us, how it traps us, what we have to grapple with in ourselves in order to be able to respond to such a calling, and what kinds of states and possibilities this dangerous endeavor opens up to. It can be hard to trust that there's power to be found in the cells and in the other's decentering. Certainly, this is not power of the conventional sort, but of a more private kind, of an internal one that relates to one's autonomy and self-sovereignty. What I have wanted to illuminate is what we stand to lose when we care only about affirmation, what we are depriving ourselves and each other if we only permit the people close to us to relate to us on our terms. I do not mean to diminish those who care about being seen and value being known, and we all do at different times. These are not unworthy projects, and they're not unimportant, but they are projects with different stakes, and they enable different possibilities. At one of Slave Play's Sunday discussions, I asked the play's intimacy director, Claire Warden, how she worked with actors around the extraordinarily intimate, trauma-filled work that they were asked to engage with almost every night. I did not know then that I was asking her a question about the bending of the will. How did she, I wanted to know, help them counter their resistances to subjecting themselves to the play again and again, and to be passible to what it roused in their bodies? And then she told me something really beautiful. She said, I will say to actors when I work with them that this isn't necessarily about being comfortable. That's certainly the case with this play. I don't need you to be comfortable. This will be uncomfortable. What we're looking for you is to feel human. That the full range of humanity is not reachable through safety, control, or recognition, but in daring to risk the excitement of danger, to tread into places that scare yet thrill us, assuming such risks despite not knowing what they will usher in, yet throwing ourselves into the experience anyway. This is the wager of this volume. Thank you.
Sort of like you're a moose between whatever the appetizer was and the course, which is the conversation. But when we sort of mapped this out, we agreed we'd sort of say a couple of opening thoughts. And I thought I would start just briefly by, first, actually, I'm going to say, I don't never do this, but like, I've been terrified of this event. I'm never like that terrified of public events, but it's been kind of freaking me out how much I've been terrified about this event. Like when I showed up, I had to strip all my layers off because I was sweating. And I've been trying to think about why that is. Because I normally, you know, it's like, whatever, show up and talk about a book, but like, why is it that I'm terrified to talk about this book in particular? And it sort of occurred to me while you were talking, and for those of you that read the play, what you will realize that you may not know is that like, it's obsessive, the degree to which she goes to slave play. And you kind of enter into that in the text, you enter into that obsession. And I realized that I think some of my anxiety is, I admitted to Avgi last week that I've never seen nor read Slave Play, right? So this entire editorial process I've been living, that's not why I'm nervous today, but I think, you know, you can do with that what you will. But I realize on some level, this book has become my slave play. So this is a text that I continually go back to and that I have been obsessing about since it first came into my life. And the way it came into my life is a couple of years ago, I was working on a paper that I'm still working on, probably never finish. And, you know, theoretically it was about queer theory, but what it was really about, and this is a public story, but one of my partners had converted or contracted HIV. And in the process, I had been exposed. And it wasn't the contraction of HIV or the exposure that was the sort of shattering event. It was more this kind of what seemed like a rupture of trust. in a long-standing relationship. So I was trying to write this essay to work through it, and it wasn't very good. And Anne was talking to me about it. She said, I know exactly who should look at this. And so Avgi, who I'd never met in my life, read this paper. We have this extraordinary back and forth on email. We talk, and I read one of the essays that would be the foundation to this book on overwhelm. And the first thing that blew me away was that this brilliant person who I'd never met was willing to work through my relationship issues that I was sublimating in my scholarship. And I was like, oh, this is why you have friends that are psychoanalysts. But the second thing was that she offered a gentle course correction with me, which is that I had been trying to work through this experience of shattering vis-a-vis Freud's death drive, and thinking about the way that Freud articulates life's will towards death, and that this break of trust that my partner and I were experiencing was grounded in this kind of will towards death. And what Avgi's work opened up was another way of understanding what was happening, which was that in fact we had entered into a kind of state of undoing with each other, and we were trying to figure out at that point what the relationship was. And 2 weeks ago, my partners and I were out to dinner with a friend whose boyfriend, and he just went open. And of course, as soon as they opened up their relationship, all of the times that his boyfriend had cheated on him had been coming up to him at bars and being like, your boyfriend sucked my dick last year when you were in a monogamous relationship. And so he was crying at dinner, and he said, I just feel like I've lost his trust. And I finally realized what Avgi has been teaching me this whole time, which is, and I looked at him, I said, no, you didn't lose his trust. You never had that. That was a fantasy. You had a fantasy of an ideal with him, like the first 3 to 4 years of a relationship. You think you have trust, but you don't. It's all a lie. And what happened in this exchange was that that was revealed, so that you actually saw what the terrain of the relationship was. And now you're starting to do the work of building trust, and that is terrifying. And that's why you're crying right now. And that is the sort of boiled down takeaway of why I have been returning to my slave play, which is Avgi's text over and over and over again, which is to try to learn about how we open up within shattering or traumatic experiences to another kind of way of being and relating. So from that moment, that first conversation, Avgi, I started following her work, and we started opening up a conversation about a possibility of a book. And I have had the selfishly delightful experience of just working closely with you and thinking about these ideas. And I think that's the other reason that I feel terrified being here right now, is I'm like, I still feel like I'm learning from the book, so I'm not ready. And in a weird way, I'm not ready to like give it out. So that's what we're going to do here. And what we kind of settled on is the book has a number of really key concepts. And because I had a headache this morning and accidentally took, sorry, I'm just throwing Avgi's book on the ground, accidentally took 2 ibuprofen from the 7-Eleven that turned out to be, what is this called? Like,
Advil PM.
Thank you, an Advil PM. I had to write down all the keywords so that I wouldn't forget them. It's been 7 hours, so I'm awake now, but like this afternoon while I was panicking and teaching my grad class on Zoom, I was like, okay, all the concepts so that if I fall asleep, I won't. So I have. So what we've done is Avgi and I mapped out some of the core key concepts in the book. And this will also allow us to give, for those of you that haven't read it or have read the material, some of the core ideas that are animating the book. At points we'll pull out the book and sort of think with it, but this is the kind of moment. So we're going to go through some of the core concepts and keywords. And then from there, we'll open it up to a conversation with all y'all. So I'm going to,
Can I jump in?
Of course, yeah. No, you should. This is your event.
First of all, like I'm hearing the story for the first time, that part of the story for the first time. So that's like really striking to me. And it reminds me of something that a colleague of mine said in relation not to like an erotic relationship, but a therapeutic relationship, which I think really maps on to what you're saying that I wanted to share, and I'm sharing this with her permission. She started reading the book and she wrote to me and she was like, oh my God, like I have a patient. If I had been seeing this patient before, the book is not a manual, I should say this. It doesn't tell you what to do, don't read it this way. This is what the book's about. But she said if I had been reading it before I was seeing this patient, I would be like really thinking about it differently. And she started telling me that of this moment that she's going to her analyst and she's talking about what the patient is saying, and the patient is saying something really damaging. And she says, I didn't sign up for this. Like that's not what I expected when I kind of like decided I was going to be an analyst. Like I'm not up for that. And this is something kind of like the question of the analyst consent is also something that I reference in the book. She said, but now that I was reading the book, I thought about my patient, but neither did he. And that was like really striking, kind of like this fantasy, kind of like that, kind of like this idea, kind of like this, I think really kind of like insufficient idea, kind of like idea about safe space. Like safe space is not what makes possibility. Safe space is what kind of like opens something up without it launching, and it constricts possibility. And that's very much what the book is about. And it's really a very serious critique, especially of the ways in which I'm not going to get into Hegel, but I will get into Jessica Benjamin, who has had, I think, a really intense and, in my opinion, outsized hold over psychoanalysis and the way that we think about recognition and the politics of recognition in psychoanalysis, which I think have really tied up psychoanalysis to thinking about safety, regulation, emotional regulation, and not having ways to think about what do you do with, like your partner went out and had sex, got HIV, and now you were exposed. Like, is destructiveness the only way to understand that? Right. And I think that's what the book is trying to open up. This is certainly beyond consent, right? And yet, like what opens up after consent, I think can be extremely important. Okay.
Yeah, and like might actually even be love. Like I feel like that's one of the things that I learned from it, is that it was actually that rupture that opened up the capacity to be in love, which is not a bad thing in 2023 when the world's a mess. All right, so I was just thinking, so we have this set of keywords, and I think the kind of one to start with, which is on the cover of the book, is trauma. And Avgi begins by putting a lot of pressure, actually not begins, throughout the book, Avgi puts a lot of pressure on our sort of basic assumptions about all sorts of things: trauma, safety, consent. And one of the places, the pressure points that she raises is this notion that trauma is something that is to be worked over and gotten through, moved past. And so this opens up into two terms that she uses, traumatophilia and traumatophobia. So I thought that would be a good place to start, is just what is that intervention? What does trauma mean to the project? And we'll go from there.
Yeah. So there is right now, psychoanalysis is very excited, as is popular culture, in thinking about trauma and thinking about the healing of trauma, trauma's repair, the notion of like working through. And I think that like part of what I want to do in the book is shatter the friction that trauma can be repaired, or that something can be worked through. Nobody has ever gotten back to where they were before they got traumatized. I haven't seen it in my practice. I don't know anybody who has seen it. And yet we talk about this and we teach it to our students and we talk about it with each other. And we certainly implicitly promise it to our patients. There are public conversations about this that are extremely seductive, because who doesn't want that thing that injured them to go away? And when I say that we promise it, I'm not like suggesting that anybody has like malintent. I think that everybody is swimming in the same, everybody's drinking from the same well, the same contaminated well. What is that contaminated well? And like this idea that, like the trauma, like Freud started, I'm gonna nerd out a little bit. So Freud started out with this notion of like trauma as something that assaults the organism. Like he started out with a very biological model. And the idea is that the trauma comes in, how does the organism manage to not be overwhelmed or not be overcome or not be damaged? And during the course of his work, like some of the thinking shifted, and Laplanche took that shift and like expanded, magnified it to the nth degree, to begin to wonder if trauma is something that happens to an already formed organism, or is trauma part of the constitution of the psyche? And there are very big stakes if you think of these two different models. Why? Because if trauma comes in and kind of like disrupts you or warps you or kind of like deviates you, then there's something to go back to. But if trauma is constitutional, right? So when you say to your partner, actually, to your friend, this is where the relationship starts. It gets constituted through this trauma. And the question is, what next? Now you have a very different set of coordinates with which to work. Now, oftentimes, kind of like that would be, I can imagine many therapists and kind of like many conversations in popular culture that go in the direction of, he betrayed you, like leave him. Like, why would you stay? He exposed you, like that's not a good way to have a relation. What about trust? What about openness? What about kind of like relying on each other? But the question of like how relationships get built is more about what happens in the aftermath of something like that, in the aftermath of a breach of that sort. And this can be constitutive. You called it love. I think it can be constitutive of a real relation. And by real, I mean a relationship that is not about cliches. It's not about the banalities of how we're told we're expected to relate to each other. Like I have a beef, like I have a lot of beef with affirmative consent, kind of like that I take out in this book. But I think that affirmative consent has a lot to do with that. Kind of like they both draw from the same kind of like liberal, neoliberal, kind of like choose your own adventure kind of psychic promise, which I think is like extremely problematic. So traumatophilia takes seriously the possibilities that come with what happens after an experience of trauma. It's not about giving up on kind of like it's not about giving up on the politics of like people not getting traumatized. It's not about putting oneself kind of like carelessly in situations where, well, actually it is sometimes. It even is about that. Like part of what like traumatophobia does is it teaches us that trauma is something that we should look for ways to get rid of, as opposed to questioning the circumstances of becoming that trauma offers. And that's very hard to say. Like if you have had like a moment of traumatic experience where you can go back and say, ouch, that moment like really marked me. It's all you want to do is get rid of it. That's the very human impulse. But that's never going to happen. You're going to have to live with that after that. And there's a kind of sadism, which is a big theme in this book. That's a very sadistic thing to say, right? And I say sadistic not because, not in a destructive way. I can talk about sadism for hours.
That's my exactly.
In my defense, I did my dissertation on the Marquis de Sade, so I do have something. I don't know if that's my defense or my.
Addition.
But there is a kind of sadism to thinking this way. But I think that it's a necessary sadism to kind of like strip us from kind of like the pretense and a lot of the temporary pieties with which we are saddled in thinking about relation.
So this is a good pivot to our second floor, to our second keyword, which you started to render, which is around consent. And I think this is one of the book's most searing and graspable interventions. And so I just wanted to read this in part just because I want to see if I can hear the sounds of heads exploding. There is no such thing as consent, at least not in the way that affirmative consent paradigms imagine it, or in the way it is sold to us as a metric that can subtend ethical relations or inform our sexual politics, though there very much is such a thing as its violation. I introduce a different kind of consent paradigm, which I call limit consent. Limit consent has ties to the rousing of the sexual drive and entails a nuanced negotiation of limits that belongs neither to the domain of activity nor to the sphere of passivity. Limit consent is not something we exercise or something that is done to us. It has more to do rather with surrendering to another, or more precisely, with surrendering to the opacity in the other and the opacity in ourselves. So the question is, if you would elaborate on limit consent, and I think by extension, this question of opacity, which is a really important thread throughout the book.
Opacity was something that was gifted to me by Amber Musser, who was one of my readers. And one of the comments that she made when she read my work was to kind of like, she was like, go read Glissant, see what he's going to have to say about this. And that was an incredibly, like, the book took a turn through that intervention. And it has kind of like, for those of us who are analysts or who think psychoanalytically, it has a lot of ties to thinking about the unconscious, but not the unconscious of representation, not the unconscious of X happened to me and it was unbearable and I hid it from myself and now I don't remember it, but it kind of like emits all of these offshoots of symptoms. But an unconscious that is opaque, ontologically opaque, and will always be opaque. So part of, I start the book with a vignette from a patient who has given me permission to use it, which I think is very striking, especially because it puts, after the book, especially because it puts so much pressure on consent. And the vignette is this. My patient describes, she's with a lover and they have agreed to do a scene. And the agreement is that the lover will slap her. They have negotiated it, they have limits, they have like safe words, they've done everything right. And the lover slaps her, and it turns out that the slap, she says, was exquisite. It was so perfect. It was the right amount of force, the right part of her face. She had the right look. Everything was ideal. And she safe words. Because, she says, I wasn't prepared for an exquisite slap. I thought I was going to get a mediocre one. Now, if you're laughing because you're getting what this is about. Why? Because this is ostensibly consent is about protecting you. But we begin to see with this example that consent is also an internal affair. What do you do with the distance between what you imagine when you negotiate this and don't touch me this way, or don't do that to me, or don't call me that, or don't have sex with people outside the relationship, or whatever it is, right? And then you find yourself actually getting something that kind of like vibrates on an entirely different frequency than what you thought. In this example, something happens that really touches her at the core of her being, and it's too much for her. She cannot bear it. So the no, the safe word, is not about the other person. And she's actually somebody who does not turn this into, as can also happen, like, I said this, but I didn't mean this, you can read my cues. Like, she's like, she did exactly what we agreed on, but I couldn't stand it. Right? So we begin to see that consent is also an internal affair. And it's an internal affair in a way that is not actually at our conscious disposal, or it's not necessarily an agentic decision. The question of so many factors go into whether at that moment like this, you're going to be able to actually give yourself over to the experience, including factors that have to do with chance, which is something that psychoanalysis does not like to think about. Right? So not everything is like psychically determined. As psychoanalysts like to say, and basically kill any idea around opacity. So part of what this individual is not able to tolerate is encountering the opacity in herself. Right? So you could say, but is it possible that at this moment she remembered this, or she had that experience? You could do that kind of archaeological digging, and psychoanalysts will go to that. But part of what I'm trying to do in the book is actually urge somebody to not go in that direction. And what if we take seriously that there's something in us that we can never reach, can never be fully articulated, and that needs to be respected. So limit consent is more about what happens when you step into the fray of an experience with somebody, as opposed to guarding yourself. Like, what if we think of experiences as kind of like throwing oneself into experience, risking the thing that you had not imagined you would want? Not because the other person wants it, and now that you're giving into their will, right? Not because you are exercising your will of, I'm going to stay in it because Saketopoulou's book says, like, traumatophilia, right? Not in that way. Like, what if you take a risk with yourself? And this is in many ways, in we do as analysts, kind of like so much of what we do is taking risks with ourselves when we sit with patients, even though that's not the way that we talk about it. And those kinds of risks means also that we're exposed to the opacity in ourselves. It's not about grasping something.
So I have two keywords to follow up. I'm very Virgo, like I like a plan. So I have two keywords I'm trying to figure out which one to go with. Maybe I'll say this. When you give us the theory of limit consent and flesh it out most sort of expansively, it's in the book's second body chapter. And that chapter begins with a story that I at least have always read as a kind of queer feminist revision of Freud's fourth dog story. So for those of you that don't know that, in the pleasure principle, beyond the pleasure principle, Freud tells the story of a little boy who throws, a toy and then pulls it back. And it's this kind of loss and then pulling it back and experiencing. And he sort of reads it out into the child's larger experience of trauma and loss, including the loss of the kid's mother at a certain point. And then like fails to mention that it's his grandkid. And he's talking also about the loss of his daughter, which is like an extraordinary moment. So in the story that Avgi tells, it's a friend who's playing with her kid. And the kid effectively is like, you kind of terrorize me until I say no and you stop. And then at a point, the kid is taking all delight in this. And then the kid says, okay, new rule. Next time when I say stop, you don't. And this sort of leads to a kind of ethical quandary on the part of the parent. And you relate this to a story with the scene of analysis, right? A similar moment where, say, you might suggest to someone that you're working with, well, might this moment have something to do with your experience with childhood sexual trauma? And that there's a moment where the person says, no, I'm not ready to deal with that. I don't want to have that conversation. So part of limit consent is how you navigate that kind of break.
Yeah.
So I wonder if like you would be willing just to kind of rip on those moments and also confirm my theory that is a real life approach. Or did I make that up totally?
I think I haven't thought of it this way. It's a very interesting way to think about it. So thank you for like adding that. Here's what I would say. I think, the moment that the kid says, okay, you're no longer this thing where I tell you to stop, you stop, you do it. The mother has been doing exactly what the child has been asking, right? And now the child says, actually, no. So the question is, you could go for, what is the child really asking for? This is what a psychoanalyst, what is this really about? Is this about trust? Is this about like, what is it that the child is trying to recreate? The mother, of course, is in a very difficult situation. Like if she, like the safest thing to say is like, we're not going to play this game, right? But the question is what happens, and I don't say in the book whether they actually play this game or not. I never answer that. What happens if like she plays this game? How is she going to know that when the kid says no, the no that is now direction is to disrespect it, that actually this is the real no, or is this, did she change her mind? Is this, how is she going to read it? So part of what I take this as a starting point to say, if the mother is going to participate in this game, she's going to be having to do two things. The first is she has to be minding the child and safety and all of that, right? The other thing is she will have to counteract something in herself, because the mother will not want to play this game. If she's going to enter that, she has to counteract something. Of course, we're not talking about a sadistic mother or a pathological mother, right? But if she's going to engage in that game, she will have to push back something in herself, which doesn't want to hurt her child, doesn't want to be a bad mother, who would rather play it safe, to actually enter what? To enter something unknown. And it is unknown for her, and it is unknown for the child. And of course, the implications for that are wildly asymmetrical, as is the responsibility, right? If something goes wrong, they're not both at fault. It's going to be on the mother, right? So this is the trick with limit consent. Like usually we think of kind of like the vulnerability is with the child, but there's a different kind of vulnerability that I make a big deal out of in the book, which is the vulnerability of actually taking the risk of pushing a limit or staying with a limit. And like there's this quote that I really love from one of an analyst for Jay Greenberg, who says some version of like the psychoanalysis that is without being safe, the psychoanalysis does not start, but if it's too safe, it will never launch. But how do you get to that pushing? And the example that Josh was bringing up about sexual abuse is I say in the book, like, a patient comes in and says, I have panic attacks and I've also been sexually abused, but we're not going to talk about the sexual abuse. I'm just here to deal with the panic attacks. Now, no analyst in their right mind, and I'm sorry if I'm ruining things, will actually do that. Right? Nobody. You actually don't want an analyst who will do that. But an analyst who goes in and is like, you know what, I think that your panic attacks are about your sexual abuse. That's a violation of consent in some way, right? The patient's not going to be able to go there. But you also cannot wait for the patient to be ready, which is the way that we usually talk, because the patient will never be ready to talk about something painful. What the ego does is it wants to be safe. So basically, what you're doing is, and that's another thing that we don't talk about openly, is you seduce the patient into a relationship. And by seduction, I'm not talking about like doing something, I'm not talking about lying, I'm not talking about like faking it, I'm not talking about acting like you're not going to talk about it, but you're going to sneak it in. I'm not talking about that. But eventually what does end happening is exactly that you actually begin to push at the very site where things could go, and if they go wrong, it's on you. And no analyst wants that on their conscience, but also we cannot do the work without it. So part of what I'm saying is that, certainly for psychoanalysis, but also in a lot of kind of like erotic relation, a lot of kind of like these kinds of encounters can feel very confusing. And here's where opacity becomes very important. But it's not about figuring out, was it right or was it not? Was it fair? Was it not fair? Like once you jump in hopefully with another person. And you're going to kind of like live it out with another person. And hopefully, if you're lucky, that person sticks around to live it out with you. And that's like the lotto. Like if you get that, like jackpot, okay, it's very rare. That's very important.
That jackpot has another word, which is our next keyword. Please with us. Well, just as we thought this structure would work, but it's working so far. Which is that moment of sort of going into that gap together. I might even say leaping into that gap. Can lead to a kind of sensation, one in which there is a kind of buildup of excess and meaning, and can deliver, doesn't always, but can deliver one to an experience of what you describe as overwhelm. So without me glossing it, it's one of my favorite concepts in the text, and that it's like profoundly useful. That will make all of your messier moments in life much more navigable. Not better, just navigable. Would you talk to us about what overwhelm is and what it is to be in that state and what work gets done?
Overwhelm, to kind of like just say a little bit from a psychoanalytic perspective, which is the perspective from which I work in the book. The whole idea is that, you know, like in psychoanalytic theory, that the ego, our sense of ourselves, like when you say I am this, whether that's an identity or a characterization of yourself, kind of like your ego, the way that you're kind of like you coagulate, some of which is conscious and some of which is not conscious, you're not aware of it, is kind of like a very stable structure. And kind of like if we leave situations of like pathology out of it, like where somebody is psychotic and cannot coagulate a self, what the self wants is to stay organized. Kind of like, so the self will do everything it can, including paradoxically hurting itself by missing out on experience, by missing out on life, by trying to stay safe. In situations where two people actually step into that fray together, and I say a lot in the book about like the excitements that come with these kinds of escalations as kind of like sites of trauma get approached or kind of like moments of intensity get activated. There's a point after which it becomes too much. Now, most of psychoanalysis kind of like, you know, there's a lot of theorizing that kind of like actually talks about emotional regulation, kind of like, and for some people, the moment there is to pull back and organize yourself, right? But the question that doesn't get explored is what happens past that brink, other than a breakdown in the sense of like a psychotic episode or like a huge crisis. And part of what I try to say in the book is that a lot can happen after that brink. And what can happen is kind of like both, kind of like can be both, it opens up to a space that cannot be predicted, whose effect it's the effects of which cannot be predicted ahead of time. Because part of what happens when the ego comes undone is there's a possibility for it to come back together in a different way. So, you know, in some ways, like Leo Bersani, for those of you who are familiar with his work, talks about self-shattering, right? But in Leo Bersani, self-shattering is always hopeful, right? There's always like a good outcome. Overwhelm does not guarantee you that outcome. It says you're going to play with fire. You're actually playing with fire. Something could go wrong. So when the mother says, I'm actually not going to play this way with my child, she's right, something could go wrong. So the question is, what throws you in that state? Under what conditions does one go there? And does one go there with a partner or with an analyst, or somebody brings you there and then you accept the slap or you don't accept the slap? Like if you had an exquisite slap, are you like too much, or are you like, okay, too much and, right? And that's a particular kind of aesthetic. It's definitely not, this is not a how-to, it's not for everyone, but it appeals to certain kinds of psychic sensibilities, I think in all of us, and we all respond to it in different ways. So overwhelm opens up to this space, like in the beginning of my work, like I used to talk about in the context of you come undone and then maybe you get stitched together differently. And that's where the psychic transformation can happen. Rather than you come to understand yourself better, you just change, like something like your understanding of relationships has transformed, right? This is not through teaching or through coming to realize something. It's through like a tremendous crisis, right? There's one more thing that I wanted to say about it. Oh, it's also possible, it's only after the fact that you will know if that thing was destructive. Right? So if you had not been able to shift this way, whatever story your partner has about what happened would not be the same story for sure, right? So the question is kind of like, whose responsibility is that? Like, how do you get into that? And this is where things become very tricky, because if you're thinking with the ego and with psychic organization, you're thinking of like you and me. This is a domain of actually like boundaries coming undone and kind of like stepping into something together. And it's a domain of tremendous responsibility, I think, but it's not the responsibility of like do it right. It's the responsibility of stay present, however bad it is. And I'm not here talking about masochism, about like however bad it is, you're in a bad relationship, stay present so that you can figure it out. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about having taken a risk with somebody and then you're in it and they're in it too. And now instead of kind of like you betrayed me, I'm gonna like kind of like organize myself. I'm like, I'm pulling back and like you do you and I do me. But what does it mean to remain open that way? And psychoanalysts negotiate that like, you know, almost kind of like, I wouldn't say every day, but not infrequently.
We have two more keywords. You already just dropped one a few words ago, which is the aesthetic. Actually, technically we have three keywords, but two are bundled together. So you've been talking about these experiences and you've given us two kind of core scenarios in which they happen. One is in the scenario of the relationship between the analyst and Alassane. The other is in the realm of the erotic. And you've spoken in terms of dyads here, which always gives me pause just because I have two partners, right? So I always tend to think in terms of plurality between the three of us, which brings me to the third area. So when you're talking about experiences of overwhelm, we have these analytical scenes and then we have these erotic scenes, these sexual scenes. But there's another space throughout the book that's really important for you as a site in which these kinds of working with trauma can occur and experiences of overwhelm can occur. And these are spaces that are not the dyad explodes, which is the realm of the aesthetic, an aesthetic encounter. So I just wonder if you might talk to us a little bit about what the aesthetic means to you in the project, which can then also get you back to your favorite, which is slave play, which will then get us to our final keyword. Exigent.
Thanks for that, Pete. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, part of what, you know, I'm not a performance studies scholar, like this is not my field. But part of what I had to do in order to think about slave play and what was happening to me, or rather what I was doing to myself, or like however you frame that, neither of these two framings is accurate. I wasn't doing it to myself, it wasn't just happening to me. I was like caught in something, I was going with it. But part of what I needed was to try to understand, kind of like, what does this have to do with body? This was not just about the text. I didn't just need to reread it or talk about it with people. I needed to go and not watch it, but experience it again, which is a different way of thinking about art, right? It's different to go to watch art or to consume art or to understand something about why this and not that. And certainly many people have tried to do that with slave play. But there's something else about kind of like the like Jennifer Joel talks about kind of like the savoring of difficult art. There's something different about art that works on you at the limit of your consent, where you find that actually I have stuff to do, I have deadlines, I should not be doing this right now, but I can't stop myself, right? And yet I will, and then you go. And so there's something about that is not between you and another person, it's not between you and a text, it's also about the experience of being in the theater with a lot of other bodies, with the bodies of the actors, like the audience changes, but the actors are the same. So I feel like I developed a relationship with the actors' bodies in the sense of like, I knew their phrases, I knew how they move, I knew when something changed. And I recently went and saw the new production in Ohio. And
That's obsession.
that's commitment.
That's maybe any other state.
It was the first time that I was seeing kind of like a production with all the actors were different, and the director was different, and it felt very different to me. Like I found myself like struggling to figure out how to relate to the play, because I knew that what line was coming next, I knew what was supposed to happen next, but it was an entirely different experience. So there was something about kind of like this repetitive kind of like persistent, like I basically threw myself into it, like not knowing, I wasn't thinking something will come of this. I had no idea what I was doing. And it became very overwhelming to me and to the people around me. but something really transformed in me through that experience. Like it really changed something about my relationship with key aspects of myself that I had never thought of this way before. You know, sometimes people say to me, oh, what were they? What did you learn about yourself? And I think that this is really beside the point. I mean, that's kind of like, you know, like how it changed me has nothing to do with kind of like the arguments that I'm making in the book, which is that kind of like throwing yourself into experience can actually rattle you at the limit of what you can bear. And if you keep at it anyway, maybe interesting things happen, maybe not. Like that's not something that you can kind of like guarantee ahead of time. So you sign up for that, like you have to like throw the dice. You have to be willing to lose. You have to take the risk.
So from there, one of the things you were telling me this weekend, and this is our last keyword, and then we're going to open it up to the room. You were discussing the production of slave play, and I think you said something to the effect of the production in New York, and you say this in the book, the direction is sadistic, which brings us to our last keyword. And I'm specifically framing this because Avgi also noted when we talked, she said, you know, you never talked to me about the exigent sadism. Like I talked about every other idea in the text, and it's the one that I've always run from. So I spent a lot of time rereading that chapter. I'm still terrified of it, so I have nothing to say. But I thought I would turn it over to you because it's such an important, and I think one of the more difficult and challenging concepts in the text, which is what does exigent sadism mean and how does it function?
Yeah. Thank you for that, because let me start with saying this, that I'm talking about, and what I'm trying to argue for is an ethical kind of sadism, which is not the way that we used to really think of sadism. So I flesh out in the book a couple of different dominant ways in which we think of sadism. The one is destructive sadism, like whether you think about kind of like Holocaust, slavery, kind of like we can think of a variety of different situations that kind of like sadism instantly kind of like calls out. And then there's what I call in the book sensible sadism, the sensible sadism of BDSM, right? Like, oh, don't hurt me. Oh, I'm the big bad guy, I'm gonna hurt you. Like it's kind of like as if ultimately like really infirm kind of sadism. So what it's infirm. So the question becomes, is there anything in between? And there's this moment when Robert O'Hara, who is the director of the Broadway production of Slave Play, he talks about how he's made the decision for the play to have no break. And the play it's intense and there's no intermission. And he says, I came here to watch a play called Slave Play. You want to go to the bathroom? Like, no, you're going to have to sit here and tolerate it. Right? So there's a couple of ways to understand that. And he says that in many interviews. So you can think this as, oh, kind of like he wants white people to really feel it. And certainly it's been interpreted this way, which I think is true. That works. But I think that what he's also trying to do is create a level of intensity from which you cannot escape from yourself. And that applies to you independently of your racialization. And kind of like, this is not to say that it applies the same way, kind of like independent of your race. Obviously, the effects are different. But what he does is creates a level of intensity. Of course, you can always walk out. I mean, he's a sadist, but you can actually, nobody's keeping you in the room. You can walk out and goodbye, right? But if you're going to stay there, you're going to have to do something. You're going to have to do some work. So I'm trying to make some space for thinking about experiences that bring you to where somebody curates experiences that bring you to that level of overwhelm, where you can decide to recoil, leave the room or not. But if you're staying, you're not getting to draft the rules. Like you actually have to be exposed to something in yourself. And I think that there's like very important ethical implications for thinking about that kind of sadism. I call it sadism because I think that there's also a kind of pleasure that comes from putting somebody in that position. Like I think that it would be naive and actually too clean to say, oh, but that's just like trying to teach people a lesson or expand themselves. No, like there's a pleasure to it, and a pleasure that can actually be, it can go in a variety of different directions. So these kinds of states are like these kinds of moments are like high stakes moments, high stakes in a variety of different ways. They can open up to trauma, they can open up to transformation, and you don't know that ahead of time. But they also can deliver you into some transformational experiences and not experiences that are drafted through safety. Safety can give you something else.
And I think one of the things in this last reading that I really held on to is that when you're framing the concept of exigent sadism, it's not just the person in the audience who's undergoing the transformation, it's also the exigent sadist, that there's a vulnerability in others.
Yeah, I mean, that takes us back to the scene that we were discussing earlier about the mother and the child, that the person who's actually going to keep your feet to the fire has to do some work on themselves to be able to do that, right? They have to actually be able to keep their own feet to the fire and push something in themselves. Like in the book, I call it the bending of the will. They have to bend their own will to go towards safety, to preserve the relationship, to not risk anything, to make sure that everything stays, like that nothing breaks. I mean, you don't want to break things, don't break things. But as the cover of the book shows, like, sometimes you have to break some eggs. And kind of like the book is like actually about breaking eggs on rocks, on like, nothing's going to survive there, but it's not about survival.
We did it. Okay, that was our I'm very proud of us because we were like, we think this works as a format and we think that there should be time, and there is. So we have a full and excited audience, and I'm sure you have lots and lots of questions for Avgi. So jump into the void.
Hi. Pages, so I didn't finish it yet. I think you really have this quality of explaining really complex ideas very well. I love it so far. And maybe I'm gonna ask, you're gonna explain it later in the book, so I don't know. So my question is about the concept of transformation through overwhelm or as shattering, and the concept of repetition and how they relate to each other. So for example, so what I mean by that is there is this tendency to repeat, to want to go back to the side of trauma, repeat, to go back to that state of overwhelm again and again and again. I'm trying to understand what it means. Does it mean that we're not able to transform yet? So we're trying and we're trying harder and harder, but we're not able to transform? Or does it mean that it's just pleasurable and that we are actually transforming, or maybe we're not transforming, but it's just pleasurable? So how repetition works in relationship with that idea of transformation or shattering?
That's a very interesting question, and there's like a lot of background to the idea of repetition, both in performance studies for sure, and also in psychoanalysis. And psychoanalysis takes repetition as kind of like you go back, like in Fort Da, the idea is kind of like the game is repeated because something that the child is trying to master something about the separation from the mother and to bring something within kind of like what Winnicott would call like the sphere of omnipotence, the child's sphere of omnipotence. So you bring it within your control. But part of what I'm trying to talk about are repetitions that are not about controlling or about like mastering something, but about being kind of like giving yourself over to the force of the sexual drive, which has something demonic about it, right? As opposed to like thinking about that giving into the force as destructiveness. Now, when you say like if you keep repeating and you're not overwhelmed, like what is that about? Is it not working? Here's something that I would say. This is not a how-to. Neither is the kind of experience that I'm talking about something that you can start out planfully. It's not like you can say, you know what, I'm going to do this until I'm overwhelmed. This is not how this happens. I mean, you could get overwhelmed, you could get like overwhelmed in a variety of different ways, but the kinds of experiences that I'm talking about do not happen by intent, by plan, by kind of like, they're not deliberate effects. They happen because they happen to you, like, some of the experiences that you were describing, or the mother and the child, or like some of the experiences that I'm describing in the book, like they happen not under your control or conditions. Does that touch on what you're asking tonight?
Yes and no, because so when I was asking the question, I meant to repeat, and it's overwhelm again and again and again. I think what you're saying is that overwhelm is a special event.
Yes.
When you do this repetition, it's not an overwhelm again and again and again. an overwhelm is a unique event.
Yes.
That can either
Yeah.
be information
Yeah.
or discourage.
Yeah, so sometimes, yeah, thanks for clarifying that. Sometimes you repeat because the experience of overwhelm that you have had is one that has left a trace. So one of the things that I was saying earlier is that originally when I started working on overwhelm, I was thinking of it as you come undone and then you get redone differently. But part of what I also came to think about, and that's a very big focus in the book, is that experiences of overwhelm also expand the range of experience. Like they are singular experiences that matter in their own sake, for no other reason, not because they refer to something else, but in and of themselves. Sometimes you have an experience like that and you kind of like not helplessly, you in vain repeat trying to recapture it, but it's not capturable. That's the whole thing. It's not capturable.
How please distinguish this for me from a fetish that we're talking about? This repetition. Almost, and it occurred to me as you were talking about your attachment to slave play, it sounded almost fetishistic. Your repetition theme. Help me.
Sure, but I can think of many definitions of fetishistic. Which fetishism are you talking about?
The erotic.
For sure it's fetishistic. There's no question that there was something erotic about my going back again and again and again, right? But the question here is not what was, I mean, you could go at it from the perspective of what's the fetish, right? But part of what I'm trying to do is get out of that logic and go in the direction of what does it mean to give yourself over to the drive to repeat, right? To actually experience that and want to experience it again and go deeper into to revel in the dismantling of yourself, or especially, you know, this goes back to Tamara's question too. Part of what happens with repetition is kind of like with these kinds of repetitions is that, like we're talking about escalating excitations, things get more and more intense. Like if you repeat, like you do the dishes, this doesn't work, right? You're not going to get overwhelmed doing the dishes, not in this way, right? So we're talking about a different kind of repetition. So is there something fetishistic about it? To the degree that it also has something erotic, yes, but it's not about trying to grasp this is the thing. It's not about trying to grasp the object and possess it and control it. Like I didn't go back trying to understand what real slave play is really about, right? That's the difference. It's not about trying to possess.
Oh, and I think in the back, and then you're next.
I have a question about politics. I'm a clinician, so I had a first session today with, and I also have a question maybe about first sessions. I had our first session with a patient just maybe a couple of hours before coming over here, where we immediately began to get into something together, and I realized very quickly that this was a person who has very different politics than I do. And I realized all of a sudden that to work with this person would mean immersing myself in a world that I don't consent to, meaning a world that's constructed by values and ideologies and beliefs that are like fundamentally anathema to how I organize myself as a person. And as you were talking, I kept thinking about that and thinking about what does it mean as a practitioner to go there with someone beyond my consent, and to what extent do you imagine that working in that way outside of our consent as practitioners is part of this, or to what extent does kind of this version of going there require a certain type of alignment that at least in fantasy on my side you have with Jeremy and you have with Robert and you have with the patients with whom you reference in the book? Because I imagine maybe, and this could be wrong, and I want to learn from you around this, that going there in that way, outside of my consent with regard to fundamental values about life on planet Earth, might do something to me that could be different that going there with someone with whom I'm values aligned might do.
here's what I'm hearing you say, Sam, and these are not your words, but part of what I'm hearing in the background is the question of, what if I give myself over to a treatment like this and I change? And I change in a direction that I would not want to change in. Like, what if I catch it in some ways? I'm not saying this as a joke, I'm saying this very seriously.
Yes, and also what happens, and also, or who do I become in the face of the enemy? And how do what happens if I find myself in a territory that feels like the enemy of me or some kind of battle that I don't want to get into?
I think, look, on the level of, do you want to work with this person or not? Obviously, you're going to have to make a decision. But if you're going to work with them, then you're going to have to throw yourself in there and risk yourself, including the risk of kind of like, how can I sit? There are so many ways in which kind of like that challenge comes up with patients, and it doesn't come up in the first session. It come up like in the second year or like 4 years into the analysis. Somebody told you that they have sexually violated somebody. Like, what are you going to do? Like, you're in there. You have to like roll up your sleeves and get in the mud of yourself too, because part of what that calls up is also like, one of the questions that I think comes up with that sort of thing is like, what if things that they say make sense to me? What if it resonates with something dark and ugly in myself? I think that's ultimately what we're afraid of. But also that's what we do, like as analysts, that we don't do with everybody in our regular lives, right? Get into that. Does that touch on?
There had been one other hand up, but because I am a Virgo who believes in keeping time, we are at the time that Dr. Pellegrini told me we have to stop because of our very exciting surprise. So for that one hand, hopefully you'll find your way to Avgi to ask that. And until then, please join me in thanking Avgi.
Dr. Pellegrini,
Dr. Pellegrini.
you have the floor.
I can introduce this.
Dr. Pellegrini is going to sing now. You can sing.
Are you really gonna sing?
The knife is good. So my singing might be beyond everyone's consent right now. So actually what we have at the back is an extraordinary cake that is the book. And it turns out the book is also edible because it's delicious, right? So we're inviting you to have cake, hang out, talk to yourselves, address the opacity in yourselves. There are books for sale as well, which is happy to sign. There's one of Josh's books is back there also, which Avgi is happy to sign. So yeah, let them eat the cake. So thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, right. Well, I'm not sweating now.
It's very easy. Like watching you and Moya.
Yeah, but it's. Yes, okay.
No, not at all. That's what. Excuse me. Yes.